Good evening. This weekend, the first ever London Assembly will be meeting in the West End. The people who will take part are convinced that London is falling apart and that the government is ignoring the problems of the capital city. Tonight, in a special edition of Reporting London, we investigate their claims. Just how serious is that crisis? Can our elected representatives do anything about it? Or is city government too important to leave to the politicians, as Bill Wigmore has been finding out somewhere else?
While the very existence of the GLC has become a matter of fierce debate in London, here in New York, such questions have been overtaken by events. The city's very success in fending off bankruptcy was made possible only by reducing this place, their version of County Hall, to a mere talking shop.
More about the lessons that London's politicians can learn from New York later on. But first, what of London's essential services? What are the pressures on the people who run them? Here are some comments.
The public are steadily getting more irate because their service has, until a few months ago, been getting steadily worse. And they're fully entitled to get irate. Quite at times, it's a diabolical service. Every year, with something like between 11 and 12,000 drivers and conductors assaulted in London. A third of those because of disputes over fares, and a quarter of those because of bad services. So with the fares doubling and the services being cut by 30%, there are bound to be a big increase in the number of drivers and conductors assaulted.
I feel quite depressed about it, and I feel that what we're doing at the moment, and what we're doing very successfully, is at risk. I don't see why children who are 3 now, who live in these houses here, why they shouldn't have the opportunities that their brothers and sisters who are 9, 10, 11 have at the moment. And that's a depressing fact for me, and it's a depressing fact for society.
Tenants don't understand that what causes the problems. They just know they have fungus all over their walls, that their clothes are continually wet. They go into their cupboards and the food's soaking, it's got mould all over it. And then the plumbing isn't working, toilets don't flush. I mean, everything to do with the structure of their houses is basically falling apart. They come in because they're desperate to try and get some repairs done, and usually go away with them not being done or not being done properly. I think people do start taking time off because they just can't face coming in. And I also think, I know that a lot of people, have started taking sleeping tablets, don't sleep at night. Even I think that, drinking problems and things like that have definitely got worse because, when you go home from work at night, you've just got to do something to relax.
So I think it will very soon get to a stage where we, as social workers, will be banging our head up against a brick wall. There are very few families we can actually help as it is. It's particularly difficult now because the office here has closed down completely and we're not able to offer that service because we have such a high vacancy rate. The staff have been forced to close the office down. What does worry me about the future is the effects on childcare standards and family standards that will occur. People can't continue to survive under these sorts of pressures, and they can only get worse.
I think a lot of young people are angry. This is reflected in the sort of offences being committed. I think the fact that there are more crimes of street violence, I think things like the riots we had last summer, suggest that young people are getting angry. Long-term unemployment and living on handouts is very degrading for people. And if they're degraded, then I think they're much more likely to commit offences. If the unemployment rate continues to rise, if the effects on housing and education and social services continue, then it's quite frightening to think what life will be like in 5 years' time in London.
So it's a cruel irony that these declining services are actually costing more, not less, to run. There are 500,000 fewer Londoners than there were 10 years ago, but the cost of running London, even allowing for inflation, is 1/3 as much again as it was 10 years ago. The total expenditure of all London's local authorities, that's the boroughs as well as the Greater London Council, was in 1972 in the region of £3 1/3 billion. 2 years later, London cost almost 200 million more. 2 years after that, the cost of running London had gone up again, this time by a staggering £800 million. And last year, another £100 million went the same way. London is now costing £4,446 million. David Eversley, you were the GLC's chief strategic planner in the early 70s. How far does that story and those attitudes represent the pattern of business problems in the London area?
I think it does pretty well. It represents a long-term trend which has been going on since the mid-60s. London has been losing manufacturing business all this time for reasons originally which were technological in part, to do with traffic. Even in good days, London was shedding manufacturing. In fact, this was being encouraged in those days because it was thought it would take the pressure off London. Now, since then, things have been made infinitely worse by the world recession and the British counterpart of the recession coming on top of this long-term trend. And then, of course, the financial problems been made worse by recent government policies.
And how do you see this trend continuing over the next few years?
I can only see it getting worse unless we get a very far-reaching reversal of governmental policies. I'm not talking about GLC policies, governmental policies, because the need to get out, to get into a more cost-effective environment, to get out in the green fields where there are no transport problems, where there are fewer housing problems for employees, where the rates are going to be very much lower. All these things are conspiring together to rob London progressively of more and more what is left of its manufacturing industry.
And what kind of people are going to go with the departure of manufacturing industry? What kind of people are going to leave and what kind of people are going to be left?
Well, unfortunately, the people who can move, whether it's manufacturing industry or offices, are the ones who are young, most highly skilled, mostly white, I'm sorry to say, the people with ability, with good training, with prospects, people who can put down capital to buy themselves a house. In other words, the able-bodied, if you like, the survivors, the natural survivors, are going to be the ones who are going to get out.
And that leaves behind massive social problems.
Yes, even if there were nothing in the economy to make things worse for people in London, the mix would be progressively worse. I don't mean to say there would be a lesser kind of people, but people, one-parent families, the old non-owner-occupiers, the disabled, the chronic sick, and the ethnic minorities. Those would be the ones who would be a greater proportion of the total London population. But that is infinitely aggravated by the fact that the employment situation in London itself is steadily getting worse, especially for the unskilled. What
kind of city is going to result from those trends that you talked about, if it goes on like this for the next 5 years, say?
Well, one can't be a prophet, but one can only say that the 1981 census results, as far as they're available, bear out the kind of prophecies we made in the early 70s. A city which is poorer, heavier burdens on the social services, heavier burdens on housing, heavier burdens on everybody, larger expenditure on a much smaller rate basis.
For the moment, thank you very much, David Eversley. But one problem that Ken Livingstone does not have to face is that his city might go bankrupt, since central government underwrites London's borrowing. Ken Livingstone, could I put a question to you or two about that New York report, first of all? Now, if you could go to the money market on your own initiative, on your own authority, in other words, you were directly responsible, carrying with it the possible threat of bankruptcy, wouldn't you then have, whatever problems you might have, wouldn't you then have real political power to a degree that you don't have it?
Yes, that's quite true. What struck me was the power that American local politicians have, whereas virtually every decision here is taken by central government. We can't build a new estate or even buy a single new bus without the prior permission of government, which means there's never any chance of us going bankrupt, but there's never any chance of our improving the city as we would like in our own way.
But how far then would you go along with the New York analogy? Would you, for instance, endorse the principle of tax holidays for big business, for trying to get more jobs and more business into the city by that means?
No, our problems aren't those. We've got empty office blocks standing all over London. We've got empty factories. Our problems come in creating new jobs, not just building more office blocks and speculative development. part of the problem of London these days is that we've had 20 years of that sort of speculative development. Working class communities have been displaced, factory jobs, industrial production have gone,
But that
and they've
can-
left a city very much in the same sort of weak position as New York.
But that kind of development can create new jobs, and I mean, what after all do you think of Mr. Trump, for example, who puts up a mighty building in the centre of Manhattan on a tax holiday? That does create a lot of jobs. That has helped to recreate the vigour of Manhattan.
Yes, but we have those buildings standing empty now. If we want to get more employment created in London, then we actually have to change government policies. We have to ensure that the high value of the pound comes down. We have to ensure that the restrictions that are placed on attracting industrial jobs to London go. But most of all, you actually have to start to expand the economy. There's no way one city can organise itself a boom in the middle of a national recession.
But the point about that New York Manhattan example surely is that tax holidays bring those sort of people in. It makes it attractive to develop those kind of properties so they don't stand empty, so they do create profits and are therefore attractive.
Yes, but you've looked at what is effectively our West End, the very heart of New York, fabulously wealthy, with all the major office developments. There's the rest of New York surrounding it, the other 95%, which is a foul tip, where the social services have been cut back, where people live lives of absolutely appalling squalor that no one will be prepared to tolerate in this city. If you're asking me, are we going to cut back on the services that ordinary people need so as to attract a few more large speculative office developments, the answer is no.
But what, therefore, is the alternative strategy? If, in fact, the alternative strategy is to clobber the ratepayers, you're not going to be around long enough to implement an alternative.
No, we've no desire to clobber the ratepayers. We've been arguing that government should, in effect, get out of the way of London. London contributes £1,000 million into the national economy, more than we get back out of it. If we could get just half of that money back, if we could start to regenerate London, regenerate jobs in London, start to reconstruct the areas of poor housing, take building workers off the dole, start to turn the sort of economic merry-go-round turning again and expanding the London economy, we could work our way out of it. And we've made it quite clear we're not prepared to borrow money in the way that New York did, which led them to a disaster.
Well,
we've rejected a government offer of money on those terms.
Could I bring David Eversley back in for a moment and ask you for your comment? You've heard what Mr. Livingstone feels. You've seen the New York example. How do you assess both of them?
I think New York is totally irrelevant to London. I agree totally with Ken Livingstone. It isn't a problem of bringing in developers. There is a lot of development going on in London, and it is totally irrelevant to the employment problems, to the ethnic problems, the housing problems of London. We could have the West End and Manhattan 10 times over, and we still have the problems of Lambeth, of Vauxhall, of all the other areas.
So what's the alternative?
The alternative is that we have to have in London what every major capital city in the world has, which is that government has to take over responsibility for services which are not just for Londoners, but for the region, the nation and the world. The government already pays for metropolitan police. It's got to pay for our transport system. It's got to pay for the road system, a great many other things. I agree with Ken Livingstone. Government's got to pick up the tab for those things which are national responsibility. And then London will be in the clear.
Thank you, David Eversley. Thank you very much for joining us, Ken Livingstone. That's all we've got time for, but of course the whole business we've been talking about will be discussed at that London Assembly in the West End at the weekend. Reporting London will be back next Tuesday at 6:55. Till then, good night.